When I was in grade 12, one of my teachers showed us a video of Jordan Peterson. Though I deeply disagreed with its philosophies at the time, I found it valuable that they showed that video in class. We're going to talk about a couple of things today. First, we're going to talk about what the manosphere is. Then we're going to talk about why it's such a big problem. Then we're going to talk about what our plan is to fix it. What is the manosphere? We think broadly it is content and short videos online that focus on the oppression of men. Broadly, this looks like clips by content producers such as Ben Shapiro or Andrew Tate. It focuses on men's issues such as men cannot express their emotions, how men are undervalued despite being providers, and how men are generally undervalued by women writ large. The problem with much of this content isn't the fact that it reveals that men have unique gendered struggles. The problem is that it blames women for these issues, where the reason that men feel so oppressed and feel unable to express their masculine identity and to express their issues is because women simultaneously want men to be providers and also shame them for not being emotionally expressive, despite them being the ones to prevent them from doing so. It's the fact that women seem to want to exploit men and make fun of them. And it is this that we think is so incredibly harmful. What are the ways for us to fix this? I think first we can target systemic risks, where a lot of this content comes out in places like Twitter or Instagram. We think we can, piggyback off the backs of what is a broader form of public safety warning, where we warn against right-wing radicalism, where we warn against public safety risks, in that a lot of this legislation is being passed through the funnel, and a lot of it has been adopted by platforms such as Twitter or Instagram, who now have warnings on content. We think that feminists can piggyback off of this. We think this also looks like educational campaigns in schools, where you look at the media that these right-wingers are producing in politics classes or social justice classes, you acknowledge the struggles of men, and also analyze why this media is problematic. It also looks like things like teaching feminist histories in schools, where we teach, why feminism is so important, and we, acknowledge what feminist movements are all about. We have the power to do this because, one, feminists overwhelmingly occupy positions in organizations like parent-teacher associations. These are predominantly dominated by women. They have the power to get these reforms through. The second is that there are many feminist NGOs that focus specifically on education. They can lobby school boards. They can ask that these policies be passed. Yeah, Annika.
Yeah, that falls on our side of the house. You have to defend advocating against the manosphere, not teaching feminism in schools.
Yeah, we can advocate against the manosphere by teaching about it in schools. We can teach in schools why this is bad, and we can teach them to analyze it critically. We're also happy to defend, publicly on platforms saying that this is bad, but you can't say that, we cannot have education on our side. We want to talk about then why the manosphere is such a priority. I think there are two current issues with feminism's approach to the manosphere. The first is that the feminist movement assumes it is not serious. It assumes that young boys have a sufficient level of literacy to be like, haha, this is a joke, while many of them are taking it /SRS and becoming radicalized. The second issue is that we are trying to skip the choke point of the issue, where we are publishing lots of feminist literature and stuff about feminist issues, but disregarding the fact that at a previous stage, these men and these young boys are receiving narratives that tell them, feminism is against them. So it is very hard for anyone to buy into feminism, but there's a pre-existing narrative that they are exposed to that says essentially that women are evil. Why is the manosphere thus such a priority? I think first because it preys on young boys who feel deeply insecure, and it resolves these feelings by telling them that women are to blame. The reason this is so effective is because when you are young, you feel insecure, you feel unable to express your emotions, you are looking for an easy answer. And women provide an easy answer because it's a group of people you don't fully understand. It's this amorphous entity, and you can blame it for all your problems. And it also means that, other people can portray women to be essentially anything. They can say that the women hate you because you don't talk to women, right? You're young and you're insecure. So it becomes very easy for you to become radicalized. The second reason is because oftentimes these, manosphere bloggers try and portray this like a way to seem cool. So you are really intellectually superior because you can play devil's advocate, which makes these young boys feel like they are part of some special group. But the reason this is so harmful is threefold. First, young men tend to be the most vocal on social media. They're the most likely to post memes and internet clips about women, which means that this radicalizes more young boys and spreads an aura of fear and distrust amongst all the people that follow them online. The second reason is because this is a really crucial point for their interactions with both other boys and young women, where this is the point at which you're most likely to commit microaggressions against girls in their high school classrooms, because you're not able to fully discern what behavior is appropriate and inappropriate, which means means you see something online, you're impulsive, you repeat that behavior to young girls, which we think is really bad. It depreciates their confidence when young boys in class say things like, feminism is a form of EDI. When you look down on girls who are saying they are affected by sexism, and you disparage female-run clubs and, female leadership opportunities. And this is especially damaging to the girls we care about as the feminist movement. It is the most damaging because these girls are in their formative years. Many of them are entering relationships with these young boys. They are also insecure. They seek their approval, which means that, this is the point at which they believe that they are, this devaluation of their identity, the stuff about how feminism is fake, really, really happens. I already took one PLI. Adam will take more. The further reasons this is really important is because this has political impacts, right? Many of these young boys are in, grade 11 and 12 going to become first-time voters. And this is the reason they hesitate or in many cases do not vote for policies that support women. This is why in the US there has been an uptick in anti-abortionism. This is why there's been the cutting of EDI and gender quota initiatives. Some of this we can blame on administrations, but we have to look at the people who voted these administrations in. And it is just statistically true that first-time voters, especially male ones, are becoming more and more conservative. The second reason this is so harmful is because it creates echo chambers. It creates the internal recruitment of future and more members. The first is because the more this is shared, the more algorithmic it becomes, right? You watch one video, you dwell on it for maybe 10 extra seconds, and all the other videos on your feed then also become Ben Shapiro, being like, women are, down on men, men's mental health issues are not acknowledged, feminism is fake. And you get more and more sucked in, because the more repetition it seems like there is, the more legitimate something seems. Because if it was not legitimate, you would not see so much on your feed, and most people believe they are intelligent people. But the second is that these boys talk to other boys. They form, group chats on places like Reddit or on Discord, where they talk to each other about the content that they found online and talk about, their feelings of frustration. And they gain a sense of camaraderie based on this shared feeling of frustration. The women in their life seem like they don't understand. Your community of Reddit bros understands you better. This prevents you from ever listening. We need to stop the choke point when it happens. We need to educate men earlier.
Brilliant. I thank the speaker for the remarks. Call on the Leader of the Opposition to continue this debate here.
All right, my time will begin on my first word. I think Amylee is very correct when she tells us that we should educate kids on feminism in school, right? I don't think that's inherently a bad thing. But I also think that opening government takes a very soft stance when they essentially tell us that educating people about feminism is equivalent to attacking the manosphere, which I think are two very different stances for the feminist movement to take. I think obviously the feminist movement in any world would be pro-education, right? They want to teach people about feminist history, about things like that. But I think specifically they haven't advocated enough against what their side's actual burden is, which is to actually attack the manosphere directly. So I'm going to talk about why that ruins their case and why ultimately our side will win. First, I'll refute some points made by opening governments. They tell us that, the issue is the manosphere blaming women, and that if we educate kids from when they're young, this will solve the problem. But I think, within their own mechanization, there's, some refutation to this already. Because they tell us that, the manosphere thrives in, internet echo chambers that target young people, right? That is to say that these people, these teenagers and adolescents, when they feel like they don't know how to express their emotions, when they're targeted then by the manosphere that tells them that, oh, women are the problem because you feel lonely or something like that they're attracted to these groups because it offers them some sort of solace, right? Well, I think then, because the manosphere already frames itself as sort of an anti-society movement, things like the black pill, things like, they don't just talk about how women are the problem, but talk about how broader society accepting feminism is a problem, right? That's the stance of the manosphere, that they are against broad society that has accepted these ideas that they disagree with. I think when that happens, and when they're then taught by their teachers, who they already see as sort of adversarial figures of authority about why the manosphere is bad, but not about any other ways to express their emotions, I think this is then going to alienate these people more. And I think our side's stance is that instead of focusing on attacking the manosphere, the focus should be on expanding the feminist messaging into more stuff about men's mental health, right? Into trying to give these young men in schools an actual alternative to see when their options are either to sort of rot away in internet manosphere chat rooms or to just, be sad, right? I think there's probably a better way to message to these young boys, and clearly the manosphere is winning, because I think like, as much as their messaging reaches the wrong end point, the manosphere does better target these emotions in young boys. I think because the feminist movement mostly focuses on bringing up women, they often just sort of talk about how the patriarchy is also bad for men, but don't really get into it. The manosphere gets into, like, the negative effects the patriarchy has on men, but they just blame it on the wrong things. So I think the correct point of messaging for the feminist movement, then, isn't to attack the manosphere, but is to instead just offer an alternative, also talk about why these things the manosphere talks about are indeed bad, but talk about what the actual reasons behind these problems are and how attacking women isn't going to solve the problem, right? And I think that's the more important thing. Because educating against the manosphere by just showing a manosphere YouTube video and telling these kids why this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, that's not actually helping anybody, because these kids, they don't believe these things necessarily because they think they're the most logically sound arguments, but because these are the only arguments they've seen that, like, they feel like they connect with, that feel address their issues fully. And I think attacking their one place of solace is only going to drive more people towards the manosphere. I think, I'll say that in a moment. I think, like, what already we see happening is that increasingly young boys already believe in this idea that the manosphere is shunned by society, right? That it's shunned by things like schooling. They, like argue against their teachers when their teachers talk about things like feminist history already. I think the government side can't just push for more of that and assume it works when we see in the status quo that it's already not working like that.
Yeah, the manosphere thrives in the dark spaces of the internet. It is useful because you feel like only a small community knows about it. When you bring it into the light, this invites criticism and allows you to think more critically.
Well, I think the thing is that the manosphere is already pretty mainstream. Like, it has, like, a lot of its language has already made its way into our everyday lexicon. Young kids joke about it all the time. And I think the thing is that the manosphere, it doesn't necessarily just thrive in these dark spaces. It thrives everywhere because when you only argue against it but don't offer an alternative, these kids are entrenched, right? Because of things like internet echo chambers. You can't just convince them with illogical arguments because these aren't like people who are necessarily thinking logically. They're emotional teenagers who have been sucked into TikTok echo chambers. And I think then it doesn't make sense to just say, oh, take them out onto the public forum and debate them and that'll solve all our problems. I don't think this is true. When we're talking about educating kids from a young age, it's not that simple. I think it is more about appealing to their emotions. And when they do feel bad because of things the patriarchy does to them as boys, we do need to address that to some degree, right? So I think ultimately, like, government doesn't really solve the real problem. I'm going to get into why our side does. So, like, I think the thing is, like, our alternative world looks more like an appeal to the general male population because in the status quo, because like I said, the feminist movement doesn't really directly appeal to young boys as much, right? So instead of directly attacking the manosphere, what probably should be done is just trying to shift the needle in broad society. Whereas, like, maybe right now, broad society sort of just takes the manosphere as a joke. They sort of just brush it off. They're like, oh, it's not a big deal. If you're able to, like, broadly create an alternative, no, thank you. Broadly create an alternative in society where, like, the average person in society who isn't very informed on, like, gender issues in general, like, knows about why the patriarchy is bad, right? And then, like, what the things that patriarchy does to men are bad, and there's, like, more safe spaces for men to talk about their emotions or whatever. I think this is broadly just going to create an environment that naturally pushes out the manosphere, which is what we want more. Because it's hard to pull someone directly out of an echo chamber, but when everyone around them is offering them other ways to get help, other ways to get out, not just attacking them and shunning them and pushing them more into their entrenched beliefs, I think this is more likely to actually create positive change, right? And I think that's what our side is advocating for. I think the feminist movement is very capable of doing this as well, because the feminist movement has a large amount of social media messaging, it has a lot of support. And I think the important thing is, because a lot of, like, popular feminist movement messaging does just currently target women, it appears as though they can't reach out to men, but that's not necessarily true. Because the feminist movement can very much address the issues that the patriarchy causes without also conceding, like, other stances that it has. Because these are all things that, like, fit within the scope of feminism, right? Because feminism's goal is to demonstrate to the world and to change the fact that currently gender expectations are bad for everybody and are generally restrictive on the population. So I think to address these issues more also is not concessional for the feminist movement. It doesn't require any significant changes. What it does do is it just allows for more, like, crossing the bridge to people who haven't necessarily fallen into this echo chamber yet. Attacking the people in the echo chamber is simply not helpful, but I think if we are able to message better to the people who are, like, on the fringes or just sort of in society broadly, and broad society's opinions shift from being like, oh, well, the manosphere says that women and feminism don't really care about men's issues, and this is kind of reflected by the fact that feminism doesn't really speak up that much about men's issues, then that might cause society to accept the manosphere to some degree. If we're able to directly counter that narrative by talking about men's issues, I think that then naturally solves the problem and pushes the manosphere out, which is the actual way to defeat it, not by directly attacking it and trying to pull people out and trying to fight it. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their remarks. Call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue this debate right here.
3, 2, 1. Feminism. Oh, sorry about that. Words just weren't working with me today. Oh.
Countdown made that very good.
You know what? I'm not gonna do a countdown when I restart. You know, the countdowns obviously are just bad for me. Okay. You know what? I'll count you in. 3, 2, 1. Feminism is not obligated to rescue the manosphere from itself. Our duty is to shut the factory down. Every minute it runs, it prints new misogynists faster than we can conceal their harm. I'm gonna do 3 things in the speech. 1, I'll take the hard stance that both oppositions want to lazily engage with us on. I think the POI is lazy. I think the response from O is similarly lazy. They just go, they don't take a hard stance. 2, I'm gonna characterize specifically what the manosphere looks like and explain its harm. Notably, this is a value debate, right? So I'm gonna explain how the pathway to advocate looks like, but the thing is, you have to understand, if you buy that the harm and existence of the manosphere is so terrible, so detrimental to both young women and women internally within the feminist movement, irrespective of advocacy's efficiency, unless it's entirely shit, which likely won't be, you ought to weigh up over OG. And then thirdly, I'll do some maybe broad level engagement. Firstly, what is the manosphere? Let me expand on what Amylee gives you. The first characterization I'd like to forward is that it's a loose but interlocking web of male supremacist subcultures. We think it looks like incels, it looks like red pill forums, it looks like pickup artists, it looks like men going their own ways, it looks like Fresh and Fit, Andrew Tate, Aiden Ross. All of these groups, all the brands notably, are slightly different. They don't market themselves as we love men and hate women. Rather, they market themselves as dating tips, as self-help courses, maybe even crypto hustles. They all share, though, the underlying narrative that feminism, and by extension, women, are rigging society against men. We need to find ways to produce ourselves. It's a common tying thread. That's why the crypto hustles are also part of the debate. Because they say that you, as a man, have to provide because of the way that you want to get a good woman, to get a beautiful woman. So you need to do all of these things for you to succeed. All of them use this rhetoric. It feels cohesive because all of them are tied algorithmically. Through Reddit, through YouTube, through TikTok, through Discord. They cross-recommend adjacent content. Creators tend to guest star on each other's podcasts. They monetization funnels like Patreon, like Telegram channel, keep audiences inside the ecosystem. And this is the unique harm, by the way, of the characterization. That it's not a single ideology. It's a pipeline of radicalization because content tends to be calibrated to spike outrage, to convert clicks into dollars. Entry videos start by women only date men who are 6 foot tall. Then it goes to the mid-tier where it's like family courts hate fathers and you as a man will always lose your child. And then later it starts going into outright patriarchal restoration rhetoric. So it's a slow and steady pipeline that gets you in as a man who feels insecure when you're young. And the problem and the stance that we're going to take is that oftentimes it's hard to stop and attack these sorts of things. If we look at what the feminist movement tries to do to absorb them, anyways, it isn't successful. It isn't successful because these boys are already radicalized. They already feel very emboldened. Amylee tells you why teenage boys are likely to both be vulnerable because of this and also likely not able to fight back. So who do we care about in this debate? Are we going to save the men who are likely already in this pipeline? No, I think we can't. And I'll explain why we can't later. I think the goal is that we need to stop the violent spillovers that aren't hypothetical. Law enforcement's already talked about male supremacist extremism. There's tied along jihadism nowadays. We need to save the women who are, particularly the young women in the feminist movement, by stopping these pipelines and at the very least, stopping the minting of new misogynists. Because the ones that are there are likely unchanging, are likely unable to shift in their ideology that much. I think that's the hard stance that we're going to take and defend. The first thing that I posit against this is that it has a structural harm that ordinary misogyny just can't match. The first thing to say is that ordinary misogyny, I think, tends to be ambient. But the manosphere is organized, it's profit-driven, and it's transnational. And this implies 3 different unique externalities that hinder the feminist movement. The first is that it obviously creates a policy drag. A lot of these coordinated sorts of A lot of these coordinated groups tend to swamp consultations on custodies, on trans rights, on sexual assault reform. So this slows legislation for all the goals that the feminist movement wants. But two, it's a massive economic cost. Companies tend to spend millions on security and deepfake removal for female executives and journalists because now they're like slammed across the manosphere in ways that tend to be massively harmful. But three, it has a feedback loop into far-right politics. So if you look at like January 6th detainees, I read this on Twitter a minute ago, to be honest. But if you look at January 6th detainees and like a lot of the extremist forums in Europe, they tend to cross-post between misogyny and ethno-nationalist channels. There's a lot of interlinking between these. So these groups tend to be uniquely interlinked. And here's the problem, right? And here's why it can't survive. It can't survive because ultimately these things lead into real-world violence. We think a lot of incel-motivated attacks just become far more common in the world that we live in. We think we see loads of different school shootings and loads of different attacks that are motivated by this deep sense of insecurity that you can't exist. And this insecurity already exists and is likely to maintain. But two, and I think a more important harm, is that it hollows out girls' self-worth at a massive scale. Because when schools are flooded with Tate-style rhetoric, with Aiden Ross-type rhetoric, we think teenage girls describe deleting their sorts of social media apps because they just want to avoid classmates who parrot it. They become scared to engage in the classroom because of the hold that men have over these sorts of spheres. We think this means that you erode your confidence far beyond your confidence is eroded far beyond you can teach things like consent or STEM ambition. So it hurts young women more than all because if all of their peers and the men around them who seemingly are like popular and whatnot are telling them you're worthless, you just need to serve me. And obviously I'm taking an extreme stance on the rhetoric they do. It's obviously slow, subtle, and likely to be far more pervasive. It erodes your capacity to want more for yourself. And it pigeonholes you into positions where you're just locked into gender roles. And obviously this is particularly detrimental to young women. And I've already talked about the feminist gains and whatnot. So when opposition says engage them, and when opposition says we need to capture them, they're asking women to tolerate a movement that openly celebrates their subordination. And that's not dialogue, it's surrender. And I think that's the critical stance that we're going to take. Now, let's talk about why absorbing them just necessarily fails. And I think it's already implicit above, but I want to make it very clear. And this is like the engagement material. The first thing to say here is that the business model is fucking outrageous. Platforms pay creators for watch time, hateful clips win clicks. So as long as that revenue stream exists, any moderate voice ends up getting drowned out. Two, identity locks participants in. So status in these communities comes from having even sharper content from women. So leaving costs your friends, it costs your belongings, sometimes it costs your income. So you can't reasonably debate with a lot of the big creators here. But three, the empirical record says so. We've seen how people try to engage with people like Steven Crowder and whatnot. We think a decade of laissez-faire let the red pill community on Reddit thrive. We think it only slowed after the quarantine buried it in search and cut recommendations. And four, time tends to work against us. Each month we dialogue is another month that a cohort of 12-year-olds step onto the pipeline. Early intervention is cheap, and de-radicalizing adults is rare and resource intensive. What does the pipeline to collapsing look like? I'm just not talking about the sorts of mechanisms that we can use and the levers that already exist. It's 6:20, check your fucking timer. There are 6 sorts of things that we can do. One, we can just use digital safety laws that already are classifying these sorts of groups as extremists, and feminists can do this without necessarily taking a lot of upfront costs. So it looks like using like the EU Digital Services Act to be like, look, these guys are just actually really bad. Male supremacy is a systematic risk, and then finding these platforms, which in turn puts pressure on them to necessarily remove them. It's why the most egregious sorts of podcasts got removed off of YouTube. But two, you can force algorithmic downranking. So the same classifiers that suppress ISIS propaganda back in the day can now tag manosphere keywords, and this applies and loses the advantage. Three, you choke ad money, particularly in spheres in Europe where you can actually classify these things as terrorist organizations. That is particularly harmful. And in this way, brands who have ads that appear on misogynist channels don't want to sponsor them anymore, and they necessarily look bad. The trade-off, and the reason why this is successful, is notably not a lot of this is a money cost for the feminist movement. It's lobbying. It's lobbying power that they otherwise use on other things. So it's an easy switch for them to do. It's likely to be effective. OG.
Brilliant. I thank the speaker for the remarks. Called on the deputy leader of opposition to continue this debate here.
Okay, but time starts in 3, 2, 1. It's important to understand how the manosphere works. Don't buy their straw mans. Amylee is right. These men are looking for easy answers, but women don't explain all of it, right? Women don't explain the fact that men face higher suicide rates, that men are pressured to look a certain way, that men are pressured to take certain jobs. The patriarchy oppresses it all in different ways. So it's more than just blaming women for these issues. It's blaming society at large, because it is all of society that makes men feel like they have to get a job they hate. It is all of society that makes men feel like their mental health doesn't matter as much. It is all of society that pressures pressures men to look a certain way, not just for women to like them, but in order to be taken seriously in the workforce, in order for a manager to think that you're worthy of promotion, you have to look a certain way. You have to like have abs. You have to be like 6 feet tall, whatever. That's why the number one narrative that the manosphere pushes isn't anti-women. It's pro-men. It's what the manosphere preaches is self-improvement, or at least what their warped view of self-improvement is. The dating tips they give are toxic. The courses that they sell are MLMs. The way that the manosphere appeals to these men is by saying you are in a society that doesn't take you seriously. We can help you. We have the solutions for you. Part of it is anti-women, but most of it is not. Most of it is focused on making these men feel like they have a way to get their foot up in society, to be like the alpha or whatever, to make sure that even among other men, they are superior. What does this mean? First, it's entirely unclear why the feminist movement has any foothold. So maybe in their best case, they can stop the anti-women narratives that get these people to join the manosphere. Great. You still have all of the other societal narratives that make these people feel like they should still join the manosphere. All the societal narratives that tell them that men need to make a lot of money in order to be taken seriously, that men need to look a certain way in order for other men to take them seriously. The problem with the manosphere is that it is a societal perception of what men should look like, and they're able to prey on this. So even if we buy their premise, they don't get any efficacy. Let's do a takedown of their case. First, I just want to note that most of Adam's speech is like different words to say how the manosphere works. Like, I'm glad you know what it looks like. Okay. First, on efficacy. Why does this not work? Because it causes the people and the figures in the manosphere to double down. What does this do? Because when you have a narrative that the feminist movement is specifically trying to cut the heads off the snakes of the manosphere, they're going into schools, they're teaching children. This is obviously going to cause figures like Ben Shapiro and Andrew Tate to double down, to do things like pump out more content, to reframe the narrative. Because when you do things like teach children in schools on specifically how the manosphere is bad, this is going to cause these people to do things like, upload more videos, more clickbait titles that say the radical femcells are attacking masculinity. You have to join now. Of course, it's 50% off. Yeah.
There's always going to be a fringe. There's always going to be people that you can advocate against. The amount of people who are advocating for feminist things in schools against the manosphere does not change the amount of clickbait titles and whatever that's being produced by the manosphere. We don't see how this changes.
No. This changes significantly. Because what Bill told you is that our narrative is teaching about how the patriarchy suppresses it all. How the patriarchy is, for example, responsible for giving these gender role expectations for men that tell them they need to make money. The manosphere probably agrees to some extent that this is a problem. So the backlash is unlikely to be as large on your side when the narrative specifically, Jordan Peterson is bad for you. Andrew Tate is selling predatory courses that are meant to scam you. Obviously these people, if they want any sort of buy, are going to double down to make sure that people take them more seriously. So you get more videos being uploaded at a greater scale, which means that the margin for people who get accepted, even in their best case, where they reduce some people, for example, that don't get buy-in, people on the verge, there are, for example, other people who are maybe already into the manosphere that they admit they can't appeal to, who get even more entrapped in that, do things like talk and spread videos to more of their friends who maybe are not as informed. So you have a friend who has a neutral view on all of this, and now their friend is sending them videos saying, look, the feminists are coming to our schools, they're teaching this sort of thing. This is insane, bro. Look at this video. Buy this course. This is how you can escape the matrix and take the black pill or whatever. All of this becomes far worse under their paradigm. Okay, why does this outweigh their point? Because even if it is true that they get some solvency, they already admit that they can't get people who are already inside the manosphere. So if we're able to prove that people in the manosphere already get far more radicalized, then that is enough to beat their point, because these are the people who are the worst defenders. These are the people who send their courses to other people. But I think we can also win on their metric as well on legitimacy. But before that, I just want to weigh why perception of all of society is why perception. Never mind. Okay, let's get to our case. Adam admits to themselves that we can't cut the heads off of these snakes, which already takes out a lot of their efficacy points. But what we can do on our side is uniquely push for a narrative that can suffocate these snakes on their own, but also create alternate narratives that give these people who maybe feel like society doesn't recognize them an answer to the questions that they're asking. Because the manosphere doesn't actually answer these questions. The manosphere keeps preying on you more and more, feeding you more and more narratives to try and get you in. It's not a good enough explanation. What we're able to do on our side, which is also go into schools, but it's uniquely support teaching kids when they're younger specific things about how the patriarchy makes you, expects you to look a certain way, how the patriarchy puts these pressures on you, how the patriarchy makes you men feel like they can't express their mental health in a certain way. We still can teach all of that on our side. So their best case is symmetric. All you have to weigh on their case is the worst part. So from their own case, we already know that all the advocacy on our side is going to be effective in making sure that young people are able to, making sure that young people feel, recognize, educating young boys on how the patriarchy oppresses everyone. And these are how there are issues in all of society that uniquely hurt men, pressures and expectations of mental health on gender roles and expectations. But we do this in a way that doesn't cause a sort of doubling down. Because when figures like Jordan Peterson and Men Qiu are run on platforms like, men's mental health isn't taken seriously in society, and we are able to go and teach into schools that men's mental health needs to be taken seriously in society, they really can't go and be like, this is bad, this is radical, because then they lose their own user base who is specifically there to help their mental health because they feel like their mental health isn't being taken seriously inside. So this means that there's a wall on our side of things that we can advocate for that they can't radicalize people against, that they can't go against. But on their side, when you go directly against these figures who are predatory, now that gives them a unique opportunity to spread all these more harmful narratives, to double down, to make everything worse. So we give young boys a way out. Our case already appeals to all the people that they want to tout on their side by young boys who haven't formed their views yet, but they make things worse. So we get that group, but they make things worse for the most radical people. So we create, so that's pretty bad for them. We create narratives that also proactively prevent people from joining manosphere. Because when we're able to offer these explanations to kids when they're younger, of this is how all of these problems in society happen, this is the answer for them, this is the real cause of it, then they're far less likely to join the manosphere in the first place. So even in their best case of stopping the manosphere, we also in the long term are able to stop it too. It's unclear what their case actually does. So this is important because all the people who are able to proactively get to understand the issues of society that are caused by the patriarchy are people who will be future voters, people who will be future pro-feminists, people who will do things like become scholars, become academics. So even in their best case, we get a far stronger feminist, our best case shows we get a far stronger feminist movement. Their side, even at its best, even if they want to take our benefits, has to deal with worse radicalization. I think that makes things far worse.
Brilliant. I thank the speaker for their remarks. Call upon the member of government to open up the back half of this debate. Here.
Panel, if you're going up against an alternative movement, against people that are on the sidelines, proliferating terrible messages, you're probably not going to want to use existing institutions to try to remedy the problem that you have. We're here to propose an alternative in which we would basically go about using the same methods that they use, such as using the clicks, using viral videos and clips, to be able to send out the feminist message, but also reach young men. So what we'll do for you is first go into some refutation, then going into our points on how young boys are uniquely important to the feminist movement and trying to reach out to them. Second, how we on our side are going to improve the efficiency of the feminist movement when it comes to protecting women, but also when it comes to dismantling the patriarchy, going into electoralism, and then finally defending the well-being of young men and boys under the patriarchy, which is part of what the feminist movement seeks to do. So first, going into the refutation 200, I think the biggest problem of their case is they believe that they can divorce kind of the ideals of the manosphere with the final justification the manosphere gets to. So what I mean by this is that the manosphere, yes, does target topics about capitalism, topics on patriarchy and how this harms them, the fact that they constantly have to be the providers, how they're not supposed to speak about their emotions, which leads to the high suicide rates. But the manosphere itself is the poor justification they give to these problems. People still have talks about how the patriarchy is terrible. They still have talks about how capitalism is terrible. But what makes the manosphere is the fact that they lead into these misogynistic ideals. So I don't think you can properly defend women or advocate for women without taking head on the idea that they are headed into the wrong justifications for these. Yes, go ahead.
Well, we say you can offer them a different answer to that question. That is the way to turn these people off that path. Right now, they're only being given one answer, and that answer is the manosphere. That's the problem.
that's why we have to advocate against the manosphere. I think that's pretty easy to see. So moving on. Okay, going into our first point on the unique importance of young men as actors and why we should go into the manosphere to be able to reach them. I think young men are uniquely susceptible to these kind of narratives because people are constantly on the internet. The algorithms are destined to make you want to click more, to engage more, and to do so they use, they're probably going to put, the algorithm pushes forward harsher narrative so that people can click more and engage more with that. Now, young men are more susceptible to that, which means that they're probably going to end up in these spaces. Ultimately, what happens is that they grow up to be the people that keep these type of misogynistic ideals alive, right? They are the future generations of men, which means they're probably going to be the type to speak over their wives, to teach their kids to speak, their sons to speak over their wives. Also, women engage with men in a very important way where heteronormativity exists, and therefore that they're probably going to try to set up their lives with these men in a romantic way to get the mortgages with these men and have children. So there are very high stakes for women when it comes to educating young men and having them as being part of the feminist movement or having feminist ideals. I think the second thing that we're going to propose to you is that we present the most efficient way of doing this, which is probably creating more Hassan Pikers, men that are feminists, so that we can properly combat these type of spaces. Because if I'm getting indoctrinated and radicalized through my phone, I'm probably going to be de-radicalized through my phone. So to do so, the feminist movement is probably going to want to create men that are able to show I am successful, I am good looking, I am fit, but I also like women and will defend the interests of women. So I think this is very important and uniquely available to our side. Yes.
You have to defend attacking against Hassan Piker because he's someone who advocates for masculinity, and as promotion clarifications, the manosphere contains people who are just advocating for masculinity and not strictly misogyny.
I think, again, this goes back into what makes the manosphere unique. Why is no one here is going to say Hassan Piker is part of the manosphere, even though he is part of that masculinity movement? What makes the manosphere unique is the fact that they get to these wrong justifications. Therefore, we should take it head on. Okay, so going into our third argument. Which is on how on electoralism. I think the thing is, it's not that women are not becoming more feminist, it's that men are becoming less feminist when it comes to Gen Zs. So I think the manosphere is an opportunity where you have all of the modern day misogynistic takes packaged into a perfect place, which makes it much more efficient for the feminist movement to be able to target. Just like what you said about them going into schools and then the taking clips and using that for their manosphere content. I think it's much easier if we're able to use the manosphere as an example to be able to push feminist ideals, to get ourselves those clicks, and then ultimately being able to address and rectify these ideals that they have. So more efficient because the target is bigger and the target is much more defined because it is the manosphere. And that's unique to our side. And then lastly, it's the idea of just improving the quality of life for men. So as we talk about the patriarchy being bad and capitalism harming men, we can probably go over to them and help them learn how to talk to women, how to relate to them, how to understand women and not have women be this nebulous concept that is kind of evil because they are unknown, right? I think by getting this misogyny on a platter, the manosphere is a perfect package to be able to help out women, and we can send out feminists to go against them. For these reasons, so proud to propose.
Remarks call upon the member of opposition to continue this debate. Here.
So I think we can agree that Gov has broadly been pretty uncharitable with the definition of a manosphere. I think a lot of it is just academically lying. And for somebody who is this familiar with feminism, I think I expected a lot more from side government. Let's talk about two things before I get into our speech. The first is just to point out that the feminist movement already criticizes a lot of people like Andrew Tate. And so to do more is to criticize a lot of the other people who are associated precisely with defending masculinity and maybe still doing some degree of the scapegoating insofar as they find their own justifications for why, the loneliness epidemic is a thing. But I think the degree of scapegoating can also matter a lot, right? So not all men are vouching for the actions Andrew Tate is necessarily doing. Other men vouch for self-care or even like going out and vouching for, defending women because they should be strong and protect others, right? So I think the type of advocacy you get is very different. And this broad attack that we get from Gov against specifically Andrew Tate is precisely why I think the feminist movement is also going to do a very bad job at trying to push for, changes with the manosphere. So I think that the way this attack goes, unfortunately, CG needed to prove likelihood of what they said is going to happen. I think that it's likely going to also summate what all men are kind of doing. And say, if you're going to follow these specific gym routines, if you involve yourself in crypto whatsoever, then you're also involving yourself with the communities adjacent to being hugely, hugely misogynistic. And I think that this is unfair for a lot of men who are not part of those communities that are hugely, hugely misogynistic, are just following these things because these are the communities that they were socialized on from a young age. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the manosphere and how it works. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why prioritizing advocacy against the manosphere is bad and probably going to end up worse. And then I'll talk about some of our end claims and weigh them against the other teams. So the manosphere is largely internally governed. And the reason for this is because children kind of grow up on social media. And I've made a ton of new accounts in order to do various debate hosting things. But as soon as YouTube clocks me as a guy, the types of videos it shows me are immediately videos from the manosphere or from adjacent to the manosphere and perhaps collaborating with these types of creators. Even creators like KSI or the Sidemen or Logan Paul are creators adjacent to this sphere of people since they also involve themselves with crypto. They also involve themselves with this particular branding of being a guy that I think Gov says you do. So yeah, you'd agree with me on this. So the thing that matters here then is that a lot of these children grow up idolizing these content creators. It's not just they're emotionally charged, they don't know how to explain their life that we get from OO. It's the fact that they believe in these communities. They've probably gone to events hosted by these communities. They've sunk a lot of their time onto these places. And as hard as you try, once you start clicking on these videos, the YouTube algorithm literally won't show you anything else. So it's very difficult to break free from the manosphere for this reason. And so the implication of this then is that A, I think that a lot of these people are very difficult to influence, but B, the types of manosphere you associate with are necessarily going to happen to a lot of people, are going to be deeply committed to by these people, and are maybe even a stopgap from some of the more conservative takes that they also agree with. I.e., because we heavily criticize people like Tate in the status quo, a lot of these people will see those videos and be disillusioned by them, but they'll still be okay with this version of misogyny, which is obviously still bad, but I think it's better than all of them kind of moving to the most conservative angles. Now, why is prioritizing advocacy against the manosphere very bad? The first structural reason for this is just that I think the feminist movement will find it very difficult to infiltrate the manosphere. I can't believe this hasn't been said yet, which is for the precise reason why once it clocks you as a guy, it shows you manosphere videos. Once it clocks you as a guy without these takes or somebody who is not a guy, it doesn't show you these videos. You're not involved in these communities at all. You haven't gone to these events. The extent of your understanding is only reporting that you've seen elsewhere. And so I think the issue here is you will never get obviously the production of creators like Hassan Piker that can be culturally engineered to be takedowns against KSI. But I also think that you're probably going to do a very bad job of how you're calling out these men. So just extending the identity of what an incel categorized is categorically applicable to, I think is really bad for a lot of men who don't consider themselves incels and probably want a way out of life. I think straight up calling them incels probably disillusions them from these women a lot more. And secondly, I think criticizing the actions these people are doing, right? The things like going to the gym and following specific routines, things like taking protein, things like subscribing to factor boxes or whatever. I think that these are all ways you can criticize these men who are in ways which they probably wouldn't really accept. So I think that by this, then, you should understand that prioritizing advocacy against the manosphere is probably going to be quite unsuccessful at being very nuanced. It's going to generalize the identity of a lot of these men, like lump them in with a lot of the Tate followers and stuff like this, and embolden them deeper. So at this point, then, like in 30 seconds, why is it that we're going to have these people be more like charged as opposed to just like changing their perspective on things? First, the way you call them out is not going to be entering their community. It's going to be external. So it's just going to be surrounding this community of people with other influencers, as CG also says, like who are calling out this community. And there's probably going to be very little discourse here because these communities don't cross-watch each other's videos. The extent of discourse is going to be KSI maybe coming up and you go like, yo, like some annoying chick is mad at me because like, let's break it down and talk about like why I'm right. And this type of discourse is obviously not effective to these fans who already idolize KSI and are ready to defend this guy. So you really don't get much of this turning. What you do get is A, the justification, B, the natural panning, and C, maybe even a direct turn towards more conservatism within these types of creators, where they now find it more justified to scapegoat women. Yes, OG?
Women talking about books they enjoy on YouTube does not make them feminists. Men talking about gym routines are not intrinsically part of the manosphere. The problem with this characterization is that you assume that any content by a gendered creator is part of dialogue. It's a far lazier characterization.
Well, no, I'm not assuming that. The motion clarification literally said so. So, Guo, you said from the wiki, the manosphere is a collection of websites, blogs, and online forums promoting masculinity, sometimes associated with misogyny. If the wiki thought it was oftentimes, they would have said so. And the thing is, masculinity, going to the gym is obviously fucking promoting masculinity. What are you on? You're so jacked, man. The end claim of our case is very simple. Either men turn towards some of these more even conservative spaces. I think that KSI probably finds it justifiable to not work with the types of the creators who are promoting advocacy against the manosphere or more directly attacking his channel. I think a lot of these people feel more justified about talking their experiences with women and coming to their own conclusions and believing them to be fully legitimate things for other men to follow. So I think that what you end up getting is a significantly worse palette of consumption for the vast majority of men, and I think this is a pretty bad end impact for our case to claim. So for all these reasons, very proud to thank you.
Brilliant. Thank the speaker for the remarks. Call upon the government, log on to the debate for the government. Cheers.
Okay, so in my speech, I'm going to tell you what are the unique impacts that we bring you, why it is more important than what they bring you, and why it weighs over what OG brings you, right? So the main thing that I want to focus on from what my government member gave us is this idea that we need to build a coalition of anti-establishment feminist thinkers who are like Hassan Piker. If you don't like Hassan Piker as an example, we can imagine some other non-man, non-working out person who's doing the same thing. We don't have a fucking Hassan Piker, okay? This is stupid, okay? It's why is this important, right? As we know from the characterization that we've gotten from every single person, that the manosphere in general is a revolt against society. This has been agreed upon by basically everyone in this debate. Insofar as the manosphere is broadly a revolt against society, a revolt against sort of the negative outcomes that certain men have, whether it be in school, they might feel disillusioned, they might have they can't get a girlfriend, that would be kind of ugly or whatever, right? This is bad because when they're disillusioned with society, they're going to be disillusioned with institutions. They're going to be disillusioned with any forms of authority that are trying to tell them that oh, no thank you, I'll tell you maybe after. They're going to disillusion with any points of authority which are going to tell them that, oh, actually we should be nice to women. Oh, actually we can work out in a in a not misogynistic way or whatever, right? We can do these things in a way that's good for women and we can be egalitarian, whatever, right? Instead, no, we're going to be oh, I don't trust the schools. I don't thank you. I don't trust my mom. Okay, she wants to give me homework. That's bad, right? So instead, what am I going to do? I'm going to go on YouTube. I'm going to look up, oh, who's gonna tell me what I believe in? Who's going to say that actually the people in power are shit and that I'm being oppressed and I actually need I'm the victim here, right? Who's going to tell that? Anti-establishment people, right? And they're right to do this because as we've said is that the concerns of the manosphere are real concerns, right? And so, given that's the case, going from an institutional perspective of just educating men within the pre-existing systems that we get from the broad opposition, but also the opening government who advocates for head-on sort of within the institutional structures, what we give you uniquely, no thank you, what we give you uniquely is that we say no, we need to have anti-institutionalists, this is thinking streamers, this is thinking YouTubers, people who are actively combating against the manosphere movement and disproving them on their ground that no, this is bad. Even if your concerns are good, this is going to have negative outcomes, right? Now, why do we tell you that these people are more likely to listen to like these like feminists who are actively advocating against these movements compared to what we get from opposition, which is like broad education, and we get from government, which is like, I don't know, I guess like legislation in the EU or something, right? What is important is because these men who are disillusioned are more likely to listen to someone who is able to validate directly their concerns with like the broader societal establishment. You can't do that in the way that the opening government tells us, because what they want to do is they want to do it through the institutions which they're already disillusioned with, right? We like see that even if they gain some metric of like success here, we see that they're still going to leave people behind, because naturally there's like, you know, inevitably going to be a level of people being left behind within institutions, right? There's always going to be someone, even if the school is fucking amazing, there's always going to be someone who's left behind and feels like they hate everyone, all the girls in their class, because they won't date him, right? Like, it's just sort of like an inevitability, right? So given that's the case, the key issue here is the rise of the internet and the fact that the manosphere is able to prey on these people who are uniquely vulnerable, regardless of how strong, regardless of how strong the institutions are, right? So why are we so important compared to our opening half and compared to the opposition side, right? Is that we bring you this key, very important idea of that it is uniquely important to combat the manosphere where they exist, because they exist in like an online space where they're able to prey upon these people, right? And such on and so forth, right? Okay, so then let's kind of go into like specifically like by going, right? So again, on the opposition side, we see that basically they're telling us this idea of like, yeah, we need to do education or whatever. And we already see that like in status quo, we have a level of education, right? Like in preschools, we're taught to like each other. We're taught to be friendly to each other. We're taught to be raised in general in like a Western society, which is kind of like the assumed location of this debate, because that's where the manosphere comes out of. We're taught to treat women with broad respect, right? Why does this not work? This doesn't work because, again, people are still left behind. People are still left behind insofar as, like, they are just antisocial. They might have, like, bad family life. They might be told by people all their life that, like, these institutions are bad, or that, like, women are bad or whatever. And so they're not going to listen to the educators. They're not going to listen to these people because they don't trust them. They don't respect them. Who can they respect? Who do they uniquely respect that we tell them that we show you that they respect? Is these, like, influencers like Hassan Piker, who are also rallying against these big problems in society, saying that no, we have the solution to you. We address your problems directly. We're not the institutions, so you can trust us. And the solution is to treat women with respect and like wear baggy jeans and like be like a flower boy. Okay? And we see that this is probably good compared to what the manosphere gives you, right? Sure.
Your side's burden is to advocate for attacking the manosphere before anything else. You can't have these guys who just provide safe spaces for other men. They have to be actively attacking the manosphere and antagonizing them first and foremost.
Sure, and I'll tell you, so okay, let's get to that then. Why is attacking the manosphere directly from an institutionalist point important, right? It's because if we're not attacking them and discrediting them directly, then they're going to still have the high ground. They're going to still be like the most anti-institutionalist. They're going to say that like, no, because these people, they refuse to actually engage with us. They refuse to be on our ground because they know we're right. We're the most anti-society. We know they're right. Come to us because we have the truth. If you combat them directly and say, no, you're the loser, right? You're the idiot, then these people are going to be, these people are actually stupid. These people are actually dumb. And because, when you're in that sort of mindset of like, I hate the man, I hate the system, as soon as, if you are only told by one side that everyone is bad or whatever, and they're only attacking like the systems broadly, if someone directly attacking them, then there's no way to actually combat the people there's no way to actually combat the people there, right? Where on our side, when we have people who are directly attacking these people, then we have people who are compelled to say, actually these people are flawed, these people are losers, right? These people are quacks and whatever, and they're trying to give me like pyramid schemes, and like they're actually part of the system, and they're actually perpetuating my problems, right? And therefore, I'm more likely to still, hate the system that I've been let down by, but then actually be uplifted by a better support system within like more left, like feminist thinkers. And that is why we're so proud to propose. Thank you.
Okay. In 3, 2, 1. What's our case? We prove to you why the feminist movement is likely to be ineffective in advocating against the manosphere. Therefore, this is not what they should prioritize because it trades off in resources and effort with other things that are much more certain to be effective and have good outcomes. Why are they unlikely to do this successfully? We give you 3 reasons. Firstly, they're unable to infiltrate the manosphere. Men won't be taking women calling them out seriously if they hate women already and only respect their fellow men. They're unlikely to infiltrate. Secondly, they're unable to do this in nuanced ways. I think it's really hard to collectivize under a united idea and scrutinize the right parts of the manosphere, particularly when there is nuance that exists in the manosphere, i.e., sometimes it's just a space for guys to feel secure in their masculinity. If you're attacking all of the manosphere, which is the likely way this manifests, it's likely to alienate a lot of men who might have been on your side elsewise. Third, and most importantly, is you come across as oppositional, which drives men further into the manosphere. This reaffirms their notion that women are constantly the problem and women are constantly against them. So when women say anything that are against men, it's going to be ineffective. Why is this not strategic prioritization for the feminist movement? Firstly, there are other checks than the feminist movement broadly prioritizing advocating against the manosphere that will stop incels. This looks like A, people and women in your life that when they realize you're going down a slippery slope towards Andrew Tate telling you, hey, this isn't good. That's not the feminist movement. That's just me as a woman feeling concerned that my boyfriend or my husband is slipping down a slippery slope. But secondly, also, men in the manosphere themselves. As talked about by CG, there are some men who just have moral compasses who maybe will say, hey, we shouldn't be super harmful to women, and this is another check that stops against incels. So it's not the feminist movement uniquely who can fight incel behavior that comes out of the manosphere. They try to equate the manosphere and incel movement, and that's not the same thing. Understand the nuance as per motion clarification. Cool. Secondly then, why is this not strategic prioritization? Because collective action elsewhere is much easier to rally around and much likely to have a lot more solvency and better solutions. A little weighing integrated here. Things like prioritizing protecting against domestic violence in developing countries is something that's really easy to advocate for as the feminist movement because you're appealing to man's want to be a protector of a woman, and so they're more likely to get on board to this. This is something you can collectivize around against the feminist movement and have much more certainty in stopping the direct harm of domestic violence that occurs, or raising money for period products. This isn't something super oppositional to men. These are things that the feminist movement can prioritize, which extremely help women in more certain and more immediate ways, right? The harm that OP claims is some voting against women, or I guess the idea that this incel movement is likely to devolve into more harms. I think these types of things, because they have more certainty in solvency, are much more important. And the voting stuff doesn't really count because you only have one ballot. I'm unsure why these men are voting specifically on anti-feminist policy and how that works. Cool. The weighing here is we just get more certain benefits when you prioritize things that are much easier to rally around in the feminist movement, and you help the most vulnerable people who don't have money to afford pads and tampons, and that affects their lives every day, or people who are getting abused by men in their life. This is things that the feminist movement advocates for, or help for mothers, and these are things that people are more likely to agree with than going against an online forum. Cool. Ref to OG and CG. The burden missed broadly on the Gov bench is why the feminist movement will have the capacity to do this well. It gets dropped out of the end of DPM that you're going to do things like lobbying Twitter and make online blacklists on manosphere content. Why doesn't this work? 1, Twitter itself is run by Elon Musk, who has staked his platform around the idea that it's a libertarian ideal, and he wants to promote things like free speech, and he wants to go against things like censorship. So lobbying Twitter is a lot harder than they make it out to be in their 3 seconds of mechanization. This is something that's very difficult, particularly because there's a lot of sentiment in the US broadly that says, no, we don't want to be censored. We want to be able to talk about what we want to. I think that's really hard. 2, even if you do this algorithmically and somehow you have the capacity to lob, it's really hard to discern, per Adam's own concession, what rhetoric is actually bad for the manosphere, because the rhetoric they start with is usually mild initially. They won't say, per atom, we hate women. They'll probably say more subtle things, so it's hard for an algorithm to blacklist specific anti-manosphere words. I think their best case, they have some sensors on blue sky, but I don't think that's changing much, so I don't think you get any solvency on their side of the house. Second burden missed on the gov bench broadly. Why the mechanism taken by the feminist movement, no matter what mechanism it is, will prevail over the pernicious spreading of the manosphere. They all spend like 2-3 minutes of content on why the manosphere is so good at getting vulnerable men on their side. A, because they're young, vulnerable men. B, because algorithms prioritize things that are extremely, put your hand down, it's really distracting, that are extremely polarizing and extremely clickable. 3, that it's a really like slow, slippery slope that's really hard to call out immediately. 4, because you get more power the more anti-women you are, so people are incentivized to be more against men. So because of all the mechanisms on their own side, the manosphere is very clearly an institution that's difficult AF to take down, and I have no mechanisms for them that seem compelling to me as why they're going to be better than all the mechanisms of the capitalist manosphere. I think that's really harmful, sure.
Look at the checking measures that you yourself give. If the feminist movement doesn't take a clear stance, it's coordinated and targeted, it's harder for these women to be emboldened in checking their loved ones, notably, because it seems like the harder trade-off for that.
I think taking a bold, I honestly couldn't listen because I fucking lost my timer, but I think taking a bold stance on things like period and menstrual products are something that women can collectivize with because they all agree on it. Any of the mechanisms you guys take are things that are pretty divisive because some women don't want to call out all men on social media. Some women don't want to do those types of things. And that brings me into my weighing over our opening half. The case on OO is that you want to expand into men's mental health as the feminist movement to give a reason as to why you're devolving into the incel movement. The problem with this case and the Gov cases is this alienates a lot of women in the feminist movement who don't think the priority should be helping men and should be focusing on men's mental health. These are women in the feminist movement who want to prioritize things like helping women in countries elsewhere, helping women in things that are very agreeable that still need change that women in the feminist movement ought to prioritize. They also haven't proven solvency on their side of the house. So no matter what, we think the prioritization of the feminist movement should go elsewhere. For those reasons, extremely proud of CO.
Okay, so we had a little bit of, am I being recorded? Yes, okay, dope. They're recording the OA, so I might end up in the podcast, which is totally fine. The podcast? I know. We had some largely similar calls with sort of some general variance. We ended up coming to a consensus decision. I'll point out where I think the splits were quite close, and then also where we thought it was more different. So we thought this was a pretty clear long diagonal debate. The call we ended up coming to on a consensus decision was the first to open government, the second to closing opposition, the third to opening opposition, and the fourth to closing government. There are a couple of reasons for this. I'll sort of go chronologically through what we bought from each team, how it interacts with everything else we got from each team. Ultimately, I want to say my biggest issue in this debate, I think, was specifically characterization in terms of what feminist advocacy looks like, and then also where the trade-off applies in this debate, i.e. how does advocacy translate into policy accomplishments, and then B, why is there actually a clear trade-off in terms of your capacity to advocate for this at the expense of other things. All of this, I think, was quite speculative in the context of the round, and I think all teams suffered as a consequence because it became quite hard to actually directly compare the benefits, as well as whether those benefits were exclusive or what the mechanization by the capacity to unlock those benefits from each team were. Okay, starting with opening government. I think opening government gives us quite good characterization and weighing in terms of what the manosphere is, how the manosphere operates, and why the manosphere is specifically bad. I.e., the characterization we get is often it is very entry-level content that is just like dating rage bait of being interviewing women on the street, being would you date a man who what's your requirement for what you dated a man? They're you must earn $250,000 and be 6 foot, blue eyes, man in finance. And people get mad, and then it's a sort of slower pipeline. And I think the second was in terms of impacting, that this is quite bad because it's quite toxic in terms of how it spreads quite wildly, why it's very hard to regulate, why it's incredibly diverse, i.e. why there's not a single monolith of content, but why it affects various different spheres of content. And then in terms of specific impacts, one, why this harms women in terms of day-to-day interactions. So this is why it lowers women's self-confidence in places like schools, why it makes it hard to exist as a woman in space. But B, why there's large political implications, i.e. a large part in terms of the shift, in terms of the consensus for women's issues, and the degradation of that consensus is a direct consequence of the rise of manosphere content, i.e. we've seen a massive rise in terms of men becoming right-wing. I think there's also some good illustration, this doesn't come from you, but potentially good illustration being like, look, there's no surprise that like Donald Trump went on the Aiden Ross, like an XQC and was interviewed by them, right? And there was a rise in terms of the mobilization of young men in terms of voting right-wing in the most recent election. We also saw this happen in South Korea, right? We're seeing this happen as a global phenomenon. Same thing in Canada. We're also seeing that young men are becoming increasingly conservative. So there's a very clear political trade-off and why this is necessary to stop the bleeding. Where the OG case falls a little bit short is in terms of why this advocacy is likely to be effective and translate into some capacity for for change. So the impacts or the illustration in terms of how we stop this from the opening government team was sort of threefold. One, in terms of shifting school curriculum and addressing these concerns in school. Two, targeting social media platforms and actively addressing these platforms and putting content regulation and content warnings. And three, targeting advertisers and stopping advertisers from funding this content, shifting the monetary incentives for this content. In terms of the first things about schools, I think one, it's unclear what the actual comparative margin is in this debate. As other teams point out, presumably in schools we also already talk about feminist history and feminist causes, so the margin they're able to unlock in terms of specifically targeting manosphere content is unclear. And I think also the POI from the back half is quite correct in terms of pointing out that it's not super clear why this is actually within the scope of the debate, i.e. teaching feminist issues in school is not specifically targeting the manosphere directly, so the margin here I think is not really clear that this is within scope of the debate. Also the mechanization was like a little dubious, i.e. like feminists control school boards. Like I'm just like not true that that's actually the case, right? Like it's true that a lot of women are involved, but it's a lot of like Christian conservative women who are involved in sort of school board decisions, and so it's like not massively clear that this actually manifests. No team points this out, but it's like a little bit absurd on its face. In terms of the more clear mechanisms, i.e. why you're able to regulate this content and to target advertisers, I bought that this was semi-plausible. We get some mitigation from the CO team in terms of pointing out why the capacity to target advertisers, especially on platforms like Twitter, is probably harder to do than you actually claim. But I buy that, especially given the precedent you point out in places like the European Union, that there still is some margin you're able to capture in terms of limiting this content. I think there should have been more extrapolation in terms of pointing out why limiting this funding is going to massively limit the reach of this content, but I buy that that is a plausible implication. So you do manage to minimally, or some amount, ambiguous margin, minimize the spread of this content. The final thing then is in terms of sort of content regulation and suppression, I buy maybe that there's a plausible margin here as well. Again, the criticism from CO, and I'll talk about this, is that you're likely to overcompensate, i.e. you're likely to not just target content, you're going to target more mild or moderate content, i.e. you're going to target like fitness content and things like that, which aren't explicitly misogynistic. Potentially by targeting that content, you're going to be quite harmful. I think OG probably deals with this sufficiently, given their characterization that even though this content might be mild at its face, that this often is a feeder content for other forms of extremism in the future, i.e. there's collaborations between more moderate content creators like XQC and more extremist right-wing content creators. And so even though that there is some overcorrection or over-targeting of this content, stopping the pipeline is still presumably good, and I don't get enough characterization, I'll talk this more when I get to the CO weighing, as to why that overcorrection or the overcompensation is going to lead to that massive margin of harm. So I buy that even if we're overcorrecting to some extent in terms of our regulation, why that still is presumably good given the characterization from the opening government. So from opening government, we get some nebulous margin, but a very plausible margin that we decrease the spread of manosphere content, why this is good for women, and why this is good for the politics of a country generally in terms of spreading the spread of not just right-wing misogynistic content, but also right-wing ethno-nationalist content, et cetera, because that often acts as a feeder. That's what we get from opening government. Walking into opening opposition. Opening opposition largely tells us that the best way to address misogyny and status quo is by talking about men's issues within the feminist movement and giving institutional legitimacy so that men feel heard and they're less likely to want to turn to manosphere content in the first place because there's a sufficient alternative in terms of addressing their concerns via feminism. I buy, although I don't think it was explicit, that there is a trade-off in this round in terms of the ability to do this as the feminist movement and attack manosphere content, but I buy that this is a little bit speculative. I.e., maybe if you're criticizing manosphere content, right, it's not clear why you can't criticize manosphere content and also, like, talk about men's issues simultaneously, right? Why there actually isn't there isn't structural inability to do that. But I buy that maybe your analysis that there's a lack of people willing to take you seriously, i.e. at the point at which you're the feminist movement criticizing the manosphere, and then you talk about patriarchy and other men's concerns, people are going to be like, look at you're hypocrites, these people are wanting to deal with it, you're not wanting to talk about like how to self-improvement, and so you're less likely to get clout and buy-in doing that, so you're more likely to get comparative clout and buy-in at the point at which you're not criticizing manosphere content, right? So maybe there's a trade-off, but the degree of trade-off from your case is ambiguous. I think there needs to be more specific clarification in terms of what that trade-off looks like and why that's likely to be effective. What I ultimately think happens, though, and this is the reason you're losing to open in government, is that while it is true that the feminist movement talking about these concerns potentially provides an alternative for insecure men to have their concerns assuaged via other means, I think open in government gives me a modicum of, like a bunch of reasons as to why the manosphere content is always going to win out on this battle in terms of talking about these concerns, i.e. why they talk about things independent of just men's concerns, so they like look cool, like why they have like identity legitimacy, i.e. why it's like fit, tough men who are talking about these things, so people are going to more likely take them seriously, why they have more like extremists or like flamboyance in their content, which means people turn to them more generally, why they have massive funding models that are going to massively incentivize them, why they have capture over like large content networks, which means people are always going to win out on this battle. So while it is potentially true that the institutional capture can provide an alternative for some people, I just buy that open to government gives me a larger, just like more reasons to buy why manosphere content is specifically likely to be uniquely appealing to these types of men. And so even if you talk about this content, I think you don't buy why the feminist content is going to displace a large percentage of the people who are going into the manosphere. And so I don't buy that you actually undermine the content that much versus the characterization from open in government that there is some clear policy mechanism by which you can suppress this content. And so I think you do some margin, you prove to me some margin and some trade-off in this debate, but the scale and scope is not responsive to OG's characterization and ultimately fall out of the debate for that reason. Any questions on the front half of this debate? Okay, bringing in closing government. I think closing government suffers in the debate for the same reason as opening opposition, which is it's not clear why strongly advocating for the manosphere is actually like, or sorry, your extension, which is specifically about providing alternative figures, not in institutions, but specifically providing alternative figures within the social media sphere, why this is A, something that can't exist in status quo, and B, why this advocacy or strongly advocating is a tipping point in terms of having more efficacy in terms of the ability to have these figures. I.e. in status quo, presumably like Hassan Piker already exists, right? We already see sort of alternative figures emerging in social media, and so why is the social, like the feminist strong advocacy against the manosphere, A, the tipping point in terms of getting more of these figures, and then B, I also think the case is non-responsive both to OO and OG in terms of pointing out why these figures are not likely to be taken super seriously, or they're not likely to be super competitive within the characterization of what the manosphere looks like that we get from the front half. Specifically from opening government, I think they just point to me that why this policy direction is just more effective in status quo, why this feminist movement's advocacy is an exclusive mechanism by which we can unlock these policy crackdowns, which are uniquely effective at addressing the manosphere, versus your claim is a little bit more speculative in terms of maybe these people can displace, maybe they'll also be appealing to men, but the scale of scope of benefit is much, much smaller and much, much more unclear than what we get from the opening government. So even in your best case, it's not clear that you unlock the same scale of benefit that we get from opening government. For weighing you against opening opposition, I think ultimately it's just like there is not a clear trade-off in terms of this motion to which the margin you get from your case applies with or without the advocacy, i.e. these people could still exist. It's not clear why feminist advocacy is the tipping point to getting more of these people, versus I buy from opening opposition that there is some trade-off with the capacity to integrate pro-men concerns messaging in the feminist movement and be taken seriously while simultaneously criticizing the manosphere movement, while there's a trade-off in your capacity to have both those messagings be bought simultaneously. With your case, I'm not clear that there actually is that trade-off, and so the scale to which you actually unlock a comparative benefit is quite unclear to me, and so it's very hard to weigh you within the context of the round, and so for that reason, OO weighs out on some comparative benefit. Any questions on the positioning of CG in the round? Okay, bringing in closing opposition. So I think closing opposition centers themselves very much as a refutation extension in terms of responsiveness to the opening government case, pointing out why the opening government case is not able to actually achieve their goals as effectively as they say. I think where you try and bring in more like unique constructive material, which is sort of two main extensions which you bring. One is why the overcorrection of content, i.e. why you cast a wide net and sort of target non-problematic problematic content leads to a backlash is highly speculative and not sufficiently mechanized, and so it's very hard to credit what that actually looks like to your case, and so the impact there is uncertain, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But two, I think where your case is a little bit stronger is in terms of talking about the trade-off in terms of advocacy, so this more comes out of the whip, in terms of why there is an explicit trade-off in terms of being able to do this versus being able to do other things. I'll point out why I think that the capacity for this to unlock the impact that you point out in terms of the trade-off, again, is not sufficiently mechanized, and therefore it's very difficult for me to buy in to the scale of comparative impact that you claim out of your case. So let's look at that in a bit more detail. So first, in terms of the casting a wide net and a backlash, the basic case here is like, look, we're going to end up catching like non-problematic sort of like fitness influencers or whatever, or like KSI in your like targeting the manosphere content. A lot of men already idolize these people when they're going to sort of be push back and be like, the feminist movement hates KSI, I hate the feminist movement now, and there's going to be a catalyst for more radicalization, where these people on the comparative presumably would have just stopped at KSI, wouldn't have gone any deeper into the pipeline, and then ultimately wouldn't have been more as problematic. So this acts as a radicalizing catalyst, which wouldn't have emerged on the counterfactual. I think this is non-responsive to the characterization we get from opening government, that this pipeline will exist regardless, and that characterization you give that people would have just stopped on some arbitrary point in the pipeline, it's not clear why that's plausible, and given OG gives an alternative characterization, which is like, look, these content creators often collaborate with each other, there's like algorithmic incentives for people to get pushed into more and more and more extremist content. I just think that given the lack of response to that characterization, I default to OG's characterization, which is mechanized for why people are going to go push further down the pipeline versus sort of this like radicalizing movement and starting arbitrarily, and why this is the delta in terms of being the tipping point for making people more radical. And your side is like speculative that people will just stop arbitrarily. Does that make sense? Like I'm sort of...
Just one question?
Yeah.
So the reason I did give was that like the feminist movement already kind of like targets the worst ends of this pipeline.
Yeah.
So like the stopgap happens because these YouTubers are okay, and people don't move to those other YouTubers because the consensus is that they are the evil ones, we're okay. But now it's like they're all evil, so we might as well go as evil as possible.
Yeah, so I think this is like presumably true to some extent. I think just there are other mechanisms, right, which is just like, it's not clear why the feminist movement reaches these people that you talk about, right, and given that a lot of people already collaborate with these other content creators, they're probably very plausibly going to jump the gap regardless. So there's sort of this status quo that's like, in status quo, people listen to the feminist movement, and then on the comparative, they're like, oh, I fuck the feminist movement now, right? Like, it's not clear why these people are listening to the feminist movement in status quo. I buy maybe that the specific tipping point is that they're targeting people that those people like specifically, and then that's going to be the radicalizing movement. But I think that needed to be a little bit more explicit in terms of how that link work pans out, and specifically the impact, because the impact became very hand-wavy and speculative, versus I think the OG case was sort of a little bit more explicit. But I think both of the teams were like a little bit speculative, and so ultimately that's why we think this was like a close clash. It was a little bit tricky to adjudicate. Does that answer the question? You're also welcome to disagree with me. It's the first round of the day, so you can leave judge feedback. Okay. On to the content we get from Annika in the whip in terms of specifically why there is a trade-off. I think this is reasonably clever in terms of pointing out, look, the feminist movement only has so much political and financial capital. At the point at which you're putting these political and financial capital in terms of targeting the manosphere, that means that's political and financial capital that you're not able to put into other things like arguing for women's domestic abuse, like protections, or like financing of menstrual products. That advocacy is likely to be very effective versus this advocacy is likely to be ineffective. Therefore, we should focus on this very certain effect like advocacy. My problem with this was twofold. The first is that I didn't actually just buy your hand-wavy assertion that this other forms of advocacy are going to just be effective and lead to political will, like political action. I.e., like, we do see some action for domestic abuse shelters, but like there's not much more funding, right? So the degree to which there's like a huge consensus for like massively subsidizing menstrual products, like just doesn't exist, right? So even if the feminist movement advocates for this, it's not clear why this is actually going to be the capable tipping point in terms of massively changing society. So it was a little bit assertive in terms of proving, look, there's a consensus for these issues that aren't solved in status quo, but presumably if we just try a little harder, they will be solved. Why is this actually going to be super effective? There was very hand-wavy in terms of certainty in terms of the case. The second thing, I think, is that OG's case already engages with the political consensus, i.e., they tell me that, look, there actually is a policy back, like, backstop as a consequence of manosphere content, which means the capacity to get sort of pro-women policy objectives passed is becoming increasingly harder and harder as men get increasingly radicalized, and the amount of society that gets is in favor of sort of general like pro-women concerns is decreasing and diminishing. And so the capacity to address those concerns or build those consensus, they already prove why the capacity to support those things is a prerequisite, and that if we don't achieve manosphere content, it becomes increasingly difficult to have that political consensus in the first place. Yeah.
If their case is contingent on passing pro-women policy, shouldn't that just work against them as well? And it's just a comparative who's more likely.
So I think their case is not contingent in the same extent that yours is, right? They tell me that, look, in status quo, there is already legislation in place to block extremist content. There is already a degree to which you can probably tip advertisers over the edge to not want to put on this semi-controversial content. I buy that they already give me reasons why this is not a huge margin of political will on their case. So presumably the capacity to pass this is like very plausible on their side in order to put in a stopgap. On your side, I buy maybe that there's a trade-off, right? And these things have equivalent political capital to act, but your case was that they have no political capital to act and they're never going to be effective, and we just snap our fingers of a ton of political incentive and political capital that is way larger in margin. I think it's much more likely that these are equivalent in margin, and I don't think the responsiveness to OG was sufficient in order for me to buy that it was like not super plausible, and so your case ended up just becoming like super assertive and saying like, look, there's this huge untapped political consensus to deal with women's issues and status quo that's just not being tapped. If we just put a little bit more effort and money into it, we'll solve it. I think that was just ended up being very assertive in terms of your case, and it was not a clear illustration in terms of A, what this trade-off actively looks like, or B, like why this margin is actually the tipping point to be able to achieve these goals to the extent that you claim. So I think it was just about the degree of relative certainty we had. You said we have high certainty and high consensus on these issues. I think A, we can't untangle the growth of the manosphere from the consensus, which I think is the more compelling response, but two, I think it was also just very assertive that this consensus exists to the extent that you claim within the context of the debate. If you have more questions, you can. Okay. I'm more than happy to answer those. So those are my thoughts. Any other questions? I'll just very quickly do CO CG. So I think CO is just fully responsive to CG. They point out why this content is like not super likely to be bought into. Why potentially there's going to be a capacity, like a harder ability to exist as these sort of content creators which are reaching out to men and not be caught in the crossfire in terms of targeting of manosphere content given your inability to be nuanced, which means I think CO points out why the capacity for CG to achieve their goals is actually undermined explicitly by this policy on government side. And then on OO, I think they just tell me that, look, the impact from OO in terms of support for institutional figures is already quite low. Manosphere contents are already clearly anti-institutional, and so presumably the degree to which you actually have a delta from OO is quite small versus the delta from CO is probably quite clear in terms of just giving me a clear margin A in terms of backlash from people who are in more moderate positions within the manosphere pipeline, but B in terms of potential trade-offs that exist, that there is a trade-off which is a clear or more certain impact than what we get from OO in the context of the debate. Okay, so any questions? I'm happy to answer those. Otherwise, thanks everyone, and I am happy to talk.